What if prevent doesn't actually prevent terrorism? For several months, people have been grumbling about quite what people knew and quite what the real story was with the Southport murders, as well as two other crimes that we probably won't be discussing today. And the decision to have all three trials that we're interested in starting on the same day as the US presidential inauguration. But two of the trials were already postponed, and the media just didn't report it. Well, people wondered why the Southport killer was charged under terrorist legislation the day before the budget, but the Prime Minister insists he's not a terrorist. The media told us he was a Welsh choir boy, and people wanted to know when the Prime Minister knew about the ricin and the possession of a terrorist handbook. Did he know when he went to put the flowers? Did he know the next day when he spoke to the media and said that he'd spoken to police and they'd updated him? Did you know when the Speaker of the House of Commons silenced the political parties on the issue? Well, everyone knew the trial would be explosive. It would be a big deal just from what he did. The coverage would be wall to wall, but add in everything that happened afterwards, something was going to come out. So what comes out of a trial is he carried a knife 10 times in public. He was expelled from school for taking a knife to school. He bought a knife on Amazon. Social workers wouldn't attend his house without the police escort. His parents didn't want him going to school in case he attacked people again. He had numerous contacts with police, social services, school, and was reported 3 times to prevent. What Starmer thinks the solution is number one, a public inquiry as to why he wasn't stopped and properly identified. Surely this will question prevent success rate. Number two, change the definition of terrorism. Now, we had no problem prosecuting a man with a Hitler tattoo as a terrorist because he had a Hitler tattoo and he killed someone. But if you have a biological weapon you've made at home and a terror manual, the law, it seems, doesn't let you prosecute the killer as a terrorist. This doesn't seem logical to me. Number three, enforce ID checks on buying knives so that at 17 he wouldn't have been able to buy it until he was 18. And the first thought of the left is always to track and spy on people. It's always, let's have IDs, let's have data passes, let's have health passes, let's be able to track everything. And number four seems to be extend prevent after it's reviewed. Well, a public inquiry into prevent, that's what I'll probably concentrate on here. It's been clear that there's a problem for a long time. Prevent was set up to identify and prevent future terrorists. Well, the terrorism risk is predominantly Islamic extremists. So it's a great idea. Have 3 pillars to the strategy. Tackle ideological causes of terrorism. Secondly, intervene early to support people susceptible to radicalisation. And thirdly, enable those already engaged in terrorism to disengage and rehabilitate. Well, schools, the police, childcare providers, prisons and the NHS are all trained to report people who are at risk of radicalisation. Radicalisation, they define it as the process by which people come to support extremism. Extremism is defined by the Home Office as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respects of different faiths and beliefs. Prevent came in after the 7/7 London bombings, and on the face of it seemed a great idea. From 2016, it's been a legal duty for nursery onwards to report people. Sounds great, right? Well, it must be challenging to make radicalised people change their mind. It's like deconverting someone from a church. The problem seems to be that Muslims feel it was assumed they're terrorists, and there have been accusations that innocent Muslims have been marked, surveilled, and disproportionately targeted. British Muslims were 8 times more likely to be referred to Prevent. Is it rude to ask, are they 8 times more likely to be radicalised? This does not suggest that all Muslims are radical, or all Muslims are extremists, or Muslims are dangerous. It's just that as a proportion of them, could they have more people who are susceptible to extremist ideologies? Well, Manchester, London and New York would suggest this may be the case. 90% of those referred to Prevent are rejected from progressing to Channel, which is the next stage. And this seems to suggest that possibly the identification of radicalised people is flawed. I mean, it must be a thankless task, this. I had a friend with several kids, and one was really skinny, and he ate like a horse. But the school was scared that they must be being abused. The other kids, they're all nice and chubby, no problems there. But the one of them was so slim, they must be withholding food, they must be starving them. And they were referred to social services. For weeks, social services investigated them until they realised what I'd seen visiting that house, that the kid really did have an active metabolism. If you take that to terrorism, I'm sure a lot of people who are seen as a concern really aren't. But Prevent found themselves facing a rather tricky problem. They found themselves mainly investigating Muslims and people who didn't have white skin. Well, nobody wants to look racist today, do they? They also said they didn't have the resources to look at all their suspects. So, what are they going to do? There need to be some non-Muslims. Who else can we look at? There was a review, and the Tories argued over whether it should be hidden from public sight or published. But it became clear that Prevent had given funds to organisations who supported the Taliban, welcomed extremist speakers, believed Muslims in the UK armed forces should refuse orders, and even those who believed that prescribed terrorist organisations are legitimate resistance groups. The last one sounds like the BBC. But I could see that someone might allow a speaker. I can see that someone might have some sympathy for their brothers. They might not agree with them. There has to be some triaging of this. But if you believe that prescribed terrorist organisations are legitimate resistance groups, you possibly shouldn't be getting money from the government. Because promoting prescribed terrorist organisations is a crime. In 2016 to 2024, of those reported to Prevent, escalated to Channel, only 9.6% were Islamists. So they solved the problem. It wasn't embarrassing anymore. It wasn't 8 times as many. It was 10%. So who were referred? Well, 23% were incels. 19.7% were considered right-wing. 13.6% lacked any ideology, and 13% were threats of school massacres. So are we more at risk of school massacres or Islamist terrorists? Or misogynists, I guess that's what incel means, or white boys, I guess that's what far right means. Well, it's way cooler to speak to them than questioning a religious group. Well, how do you protect Muslims if we turn our sight away, we cast our gaze away from Islamic extremism? Most Muslims are not extremist. Most Muslims don't support terrorism. And certainly most Muslims don't take part, intend to take part, or consider taking part. Identifying those who are protects those who aren't from prejudice. I watched a training video on Prevent, and they were keen to point out that when people think of terrorists, they think of 9/11 and the Manchester Arena bombings. But actually the fastest growing risk is the far right and nationalists. The biggest risk or the fastest growing? And is it growing fastest because you're looking for it? If you look around the Western world, there have been a handful of attacks which were terrible, but let's be honest, there have been more attacks on Christmas markets than mosques. And there are a lot more mosques than Christmas markets, and they aren't seasonal. They're committedly open all year round. Well, I'm in favour of protecting people from the far right, but let's be honest, how many far right are there actually trying to cause terrorism in the UK or any Western country? Islamist attacks have killed more than 30 times more than far right extremists. The media like to talk about the BNP, who closed up shop years ago, or the English Defence League, who closed up in the last decade as far as I'm aware. In Germany, there's the Alternative for Deutschland. But they are a legitimate political party, and other than a lot of mudslinging, I haven't seen much right-wing rhetoric from them. There are Danish and Dutch politicians who come to mind who criticise Islam in ways that I don't think are very nice, I don't think are pleasant, I don't think are good in a democracy, and are just provocative. But who are the far right Prevent is looking into? And are they doing the majority of their resources on the minority of the problems? Well, the examples I found, a child sharing Nigel Farage videos, how shocking. He won't start his voting life as a Labour voter. Put him in prison. A boy wearing a Viking helmet. He must be planning to pillage communities. Hollyoaks even had a storyline, no doubt written with the authorities, to show that far-right extremists were there trying to recruit and train people to be far-right. The mosque attacks in New Zealand were terrible, but the fact that we have to always recall an attack from the other side of the world to explain a risk back home suggests that maybe we're stretching or we can't find them. There was a sniper in the US who hid in his boot and shot people out of the back. How often we talk about him when we talk of knife crime in the UK? Never, because it's not relevant. We've had 2 MPs murdered in the UK, one by far right and one by a Muslim. When Joe Cox was killed, MPs rightly found it easy to discuss it and raise their concerns. But when David Amis was killed, I was quite shocked how difficult it was for them to admit the problem and what had happened. There was no talk of Islamic extremism from MPs. Most MPs were obsessed with talking about Twitter and the far right. Well, maybe it's time that we ask the right questions And one of them is, does prevent actually prevent terrorism? Is it fit for purpose?